And we are also going to go on Facebook Live. So let me go ahead and do that. Just a little disclaimer for everybody. Okay, going on live on Facebook. Just give me a minute. There we go. Okay. All right. Okay, now we're live. We are recording. That's awesome. Like I was saying, we're joined by Dr. Dalisay. He will present his data shortly. Also joining Francis to give a related presentation on regional news coverage is Thomas Mangloña, a reporter originally from the island of Luta. The full recorded webinar episode will be found on our YouTube page later. Microphones for the audience will be muted through the entire duration of the presentation. If you would like to make a comment, if you do have a question at any time, please message me directly and I'll read them to you, because at the end of these presentations is a question and answer portion. For those using Facebook Live to watch the webinar, please send questions to the Humanities Council Facebook page. Okay, and before we begin, I'm going to give a quick biography of both our presenters today, starting with Mr. Mangloña. Thomas Mangloña II is a visual journalist with experience in local, regional, and national newsrooms. He's worked for the Saipan Tribune, Pacific News Center, KUAM News, ABC7 in San Francisco, and UC Berkeley's Cal TV. He is a production intern for ABC News GMA3. Thomas graduated with an MA in journalism from Stanford University and a BA in media studies from UC Berkeley. He also serves as the co-lead of the AAJA Pacific Islander Task Force, dedicated to increasing accurate coverage of Oceania and providing resources to journalists in the region. As for Dr. Dalisay, he is an associate professor of communication at the University of Guam. He teaches courses in journalism and digital communication technology and is the publisher for Triton's Call, UOG's campus newspaper. Dalisay received MA and PhD degrees from the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. He earned a BA in communication with the print journalism track from University of Guam, where he graduated as class valedictorian. Outside of academia, Dalisay has worked as a writer, reporter, editor, and marketing and strategic communication assistant. And with that, I am going to hand it off to you, Francis. Take it away.
Okay, half a day, Terrell. And, thank you for everyone who is here today. And, I just want to also thank the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, Leo Pangilinan, Andrew, and the advisory committee who spearheaded this project, and also our research assistant, Elsiana Cruz, who's from Saipan and is living there now. And also I want to thank my co-presenter today, Tomas, who is also part of the advisory committee for this project. And so let's get started. I was planning to make this like, as short as possible, but I timed myself earlier and it was like looking at about 20 minutes. So let's start here. These are the points I'm going to cover today. I'm going to provide a brief background on the purpose of this study. Then I'll talk about what we measured for this survey, and then the method we use. Then we'll move on to the results, and then I'll add a few points in our discussion section. So first off, the purpose of this study was, actually this is the second bullet point, was to assess CNMI residence levels along several key indicators of engagement in local news media literacy, and involvement in local civic and political processes. And we conducted the survey October through November 2020, which, if you notice, was during the run-up to the 2020 election in the CNMI. And also it was during the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. This study was funded by a grant from the Mellon Foundation's 2019 Democracy and the Informed Citizen Initiative, which was administered through the Federation of States Humanities Council, USA. When we did this survey, we tried to look for other previous surveys that have been conducted, and as far as we know, I think this is probably one of the first. It provides a very comprehensive, quantitative, empirical study on news media engagement and civic vibrancy in the CNMI. And this is the survey itself. It was thorough, and there was a lot of variables, as you see here in this slide. And so what we did, I think tentatively, this is the schedule for the webinars, although this could change. So for today, what we'll do is I'll walk you through these variables: use and perceived trustworthiness of media as sources for local news, use and perceived trustworthiness of social media platforms as sources for local news, motivations for news consumption, preference for regional news. And like I said, tentatively, their next webinar will likely cover news media literacy, skepticism, privacy, misinformation. Then the third and fourth, respectively, will cover political participation, political interests. And then last one, we're going to close it out by talking about some community values and journalistic function served by local media. But again, this is the topic for today. And these are what we're going to be covering for today's webinar. Okay, so going back, just a background in terms of the method that we employed for this survey. So the survey itself was self-administered, meaning that it was an online survey sent to people or posted up on social media platforms and so forth. And the question items were adapted from measures that have been either validated and or previously used in similar research conducted in the Pacific region, namely Guam. I've been doing research in Guam probably close to already 20 years, leading up from my graduate research all the way up to what I do currently. So these are measures that we've already used in Guam. And also to make sure that the study itself and the items were sensitive to the CNMI community, and so that the study itself can accomplish the goals set forth by the Humanities Council, a local advisory board for the project had reviewed the items and looked through the methods employed and so forth. Okay, so next one, I think I have the answer for Galvin's question here. Oh, wait, actually, I have the answer for that in the next slide, Galvin. We use practical strategies to increase response and completion rates. And here's where, again, I want to thank Research Assistant Elsiana Cruz and AJ Sablon, who is also part of the advisory board, for their help in this data collection process. And it should be noted that we did not employ probability-based sampling. So because of that, our results are prone to sampling bias. And as also keep in mind, as with similar community surveys conducted not only in the CNMI, but elsewhere, you should know that these results should be understood only from those, or only as representative as to those who completed the survey, okay? So we could only generalize this to those who completed the survey because it was not a representative sample. Okay, so moving on here, here's the answer to that question there. So I think there were, if I recall, there were over 700 or close to 700 people who started completing the survey, but we only retained those that were at least 60% and above completed. So we ended up with 481 completed responses. And so this was roughly about a 73% completion rate. And as expected, the majority of the respondents lived in Saipan, while close to 6% represented Luta and Tinian. And females comprise the majority of our sample. So what that means, we undersampled males, or 66% females. And the age range was between 18 and 81. Median age was 35. And these were the three ethnic groups that comprised of our sample. I looked at the census data, the CNMI, and looks like we might have undersampled Filipinos. And so that's another drawback on this approach here. The respondents' length of residence in the CNMI range from between 1 to 72 years, and the length of residence average roughly 23 years. The age range of respondents was between 18 to 81, and the median age was 35. And this was the household income. And so the median income was between 20 to 39,999. About 76% of the respondents reported a household income between the range of 19,999 or less to 40K to 59,999. And 24% reported a household income between 60K to 190K and above. Okay, I think Galvin had another question there, but I think it's no longer appearing. Oh, sorry if I missed this earlier, but was the survey conducted only online? Yes, it was only online. So it's an online survey. So again, it's important that I talked about the respondents, because again, what I said earlier, we can only these findings are representative of that type of respondent in the categories of respondents I just went over. Okay. So these are the results. As I talk about the results, some of the audience members might be asking, like, what is M and SD? Because you're going to see that in a moment. M, which should be the Greek letter for M, the mu, but I just put capital letter M. That stands for mean, which is the average score. And an SD is, if you see that, represents what we call standard deviation, which is a measure of the amount of variation or variability, or how dispersed are the individual data values from the mean. So for example, let's say that on a scale of 1 to 5, the respondent scored a 4 average rate mean, and maybe I report a 1 as a SD. What that means is that the responses could vary between plus or minus 1 SD, okay, standard deviation. That's all that means, okay? All right, so let's walk you through some of the results here. So first off, our survey measured how often respondents use specific media sources to obtain news about the CNMI. And we listed, and Leo, by the way, was the one that helped me with this list, as well as the advisory committee. It may not have been an exhaustive list, but we tried to include all the sources of news in the CNMI, and including a regional online site. And we measured this on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 equals never, 3 sometimes, and 5 all the time. And these were the results. So if you take a look at this, just to summarize, the 3 most frequently used sources for local news are, and this is reported in descending order from most to least used: Saipan Tribune, Marianas Variety, KSPN, Channel 2. So those are the top 3, then followed by, in descending order, Power 99, KKMP, Candid News, Magic 100, 89.1, Joy FM, and Marianas Business Journal. And again, note, as you recall, this is a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 equals never, 3 sometimes, 5 equals all the time. So if you look at this, this is below the midpoint of 3, right? And so, yeah, some of these maybe suggest that respondents may not have been as engaged in news. One could interpret those results to mean as such. Okay, so those were the uses of local media for news. And now we'll move on to trustworthiness of these media sources. By the way, these are what we call, or a lot of these are what we call legacy media, with the exception of, I think it's a few of them were just online, or maybe just one of them was a strictly online news source. So this is a trustworthiness, perceived trustworthiness. We basically use the same media sources as you saw earlier in that slide. And we ask respondents, how trustworthy are these sources? And we measure this on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 equals very untrustworthy. 3, the midpoint is neither untrustworthy nor trustworthy. And 5 equals very trustworthy. And so these were the results. The 3 sources for local news perceived to be most trustworthy by our respondents are reported in descending order. For most of least trustworthy, so KSPN Channel 2, Saipan Tribune, Marianas Variety, Power 99, KKMP 89.1, Marianas Business Journal, Magic, Joy, and then Candid News. Okay, if you take a look at these means or these averages, I mean, one can argue, well, there's not really much difference here. Well, rightfully so. And so, this is just, and by the way, this is all respondents. Like maybe later on, we can take a look and look at certain groups of respondents, like male, female, Filipinos versus Chamorros, etc. What do they use, and what do they perceive to be more trustworthy? And so this is just an average of the entire sample. Okay. And there's one or a couple of things I wanted to talk about in terms of when I saw the results for trustworthiness. First of all, I saw that the proportion of respondents reporting that each media source is very trustworthy / trustworthy, so that's number 4 and 5 in that scale, was greater than the proportion reporting very untrustworthy and untrustworthy, which is number 1 and 2 on that 5-point scale. Okay, so what this means is that for the most part, the respondents view these media as trustworthy. Okay, if you think about it, and so for the most part, they do have some level of trust of local media. Okay, which is consistent with what goes on in the mainland and elsewhere in the U.S. For the most part, like people, residents tend to trust their local news more so than national news. Okay. And so that's consistent across the US. However, for a few sources that we consider did not make the top 3 trusted, there was a larger proportion of respondents reporting neither untrustworthy nor trustworthy than the other answer choices. So maybe these other, or from how I see this, I see that respondents were maybe slightly on the fence for the other news sources. Okay. Which, by the way, I forgot to mention, we do have a report that should be published shortly. It gives more details about what was measured and the results per item. So people in the audience, if you're interested in that should be released shortly. I think we're in the process of editing it still. And it's going to give you a more detailed information about per item and so forth. Okay, so moving on. Now we'll talk about use and trust of social media platforms. So our survey measured how often respondents use and trusted social media platforms to obtain news about the CNMI. And the platforms included YouTube, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Twitter. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of social media platforms, but these were selected based on previous research conducted in Guam, market research, as well as research we've conducted with teams here in Guam, which found that these platforms tend to be the most popular among residents in the island of Guam. And so for use similar to what you saw earlier, we measured this with 1, never, 3, sometimes, 5, all the time, 5-point scale. Trust was same thing. Trust 1 very untrustworthy to 5 very trustworthy. So these were the results. The social media platforms that respondents reported using most frequently to least frequently for news about CNMI are ranked in descending order here. So Facebook was most used, WhatsApp, then YouTube, Instagram, then Twitter was on the bottom there. Okay, in terms of trust, so the social media platforms that respondents reported use are trusting most to least. And again, this is in descending order. YouTube was on the top of trust, then Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and then Twitter. Okay. Again, this is from descending order from most to least trusted. One comment here in terms of the descriptive results. What I did notice here, for all social media platforms, there is a larger proportion of respondents reporting neither untrustworthy or trustworthy than the other answer choices. And so again, what this means perhaps is that respondents were on the fence here. This is the midpoint 3. So they couldn't, give you a straight answer. They couldn't tell you whether or not these were trustworthy or untrustworthy. That's basically what that means. Okay. And so the next, I think when we talk about in our next webinars, and we're going to talk about media literacy, we might return back to this issue of trustworthiness of social media platforms and disinformation, and that's going to be the topic of that webinar. Okay, so motivations for news consumption. We measured this, but with the following 2 items. I follow the news because I'm supposed to, and I follow the news because I like to. And this is measured on a 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so basically, just to quickly give you the answer to this, respondents were only slightly motivated to consume news. Again, this is slightly above the midpoint of 3. That's the mean score. But nevertheless, we could say, oh yeah, they were slightly motivated, to consume the news. Okay, so what about preference for regional news? And this is what Thomas had suggested that we add to the survey. So thank you for his suggestion. So we asked respondents whether or not they would like local media and the CNMI to carry more regional news from the Micronesia region. And we measured this with 2 items actually, and this is the first item. So do you want yes or no? Do you want more coverage? And the answer to that is, yeah, most people surveyed, the respondents surveyed, 84% of them would like more local media to carry more regional news from this region, okay? And the second item for this was, we asked them how important do they think it is that local media carry region or regional news. And we measured this scale of 1 to 5, totally unimportant to extremely important. And so the answer to that question, about 77% of the respondents felt that it was important or extremely important that local media report on news from Micronesia. So a total of, just adding these responses to these 2 items here comes up to a majority of the respondents do feel it's important that local media carry regional news. And the mean score for that, 3.92. So yeah, in conclusion, there is some preference that the respondents do feel it's important that local media carry regional news. Okay, so that's those were the items that the descriptive results for those items of uses and perceived trustworthiness, motivations, and preference for regional news. So now in the social sciences, right, what we like to do is we like to see what's related with what, and we run this with, on the basic level, we could run the correlational analysis is what we're gonna do right now, walk you through the results of that. And so what we did first is we combined the items measuring use of media. Remember there is, I think 10 items that you saw earlier for the legacy media and then the social media platforms, 5 of them. So we combined those to form single variables of media use and then social media use. We did the same thing with trusts. So we combined the items for trusts of local media and then trusts of the social media platforms. And we basically ran some what we call zero order correlations to see what's related with what. And let me now report the findings of those analysis here. Okay, so first of all, we found that the measure for use of media sources for news about the CNMI, okay, so that measure was positively related with the measure of trust of the same sources, okay? And so basically what this means is it could mean that the more you use media, the more you trust it. Now, unfortunately, with correlational data or survey data, we don't know what's causing what. So it could also be that the more you trust something, the more you trust the source, the more likely you're going to use it, okay? And we also saw that the use of social media platforms was positively related with the trust of that platform, okay? So the more you trusted a social media platform, the more you were likely to use it, or vice versa. The more you use it, the more you trust, okay? I forgot to mention, what I'm reporting here in terms of the correlational analysis for today's webinar, these are just the results that were statistically significant. So meaning to say, the other results were not statistically significant, okay? And so those are the ones I'm not reporting here. So these are just the ones that are meaningful to us, and meaning to say that these are the significant findings from the results. Okay, moving on. We also found that the use of news media for news about the CNMI, that was positively related with motivations for news consumption, okay? So the more you use these media sources, the more motivated you are, or it could be the more motivated you are, the more likely you're going to use the media sources for news. And also use of social media platforms for news about the CNMI was positively related with motivations for news consumption, okay? Trust in sources for news about CNMI was positively related with motivations for news consumption, okay? So again, the more you trust, the more motivated, or the more motivated you are to consume news, the more you trust it. And same thing with trust of social media platforms. That was also positively associated with motivations for news consumption, okay? So trust of platform predicts motivations, or motivations for news consumption predicts trust. And lastly, trust in social media platforms for news about CNMI was positively associated with perceived importance that local media in the CNMI carry regional news from the Micronesia region, okay? So the more you trusted social media platforms, the more you are likely to say that you prefer that local media carry regional news, okay? Notice we didn't find significant results for use of social media platforms, right? So remember, I'm just reporting statistically significant results here. So use of social media platforms was not related with preference to perceive importance of local media, or that local media carry regional news, okay? So that wasn't a statistically significant finding, and that's why I'm not reporting it here. Okay, and so those were the results. Let me now conclude with some discussion here about what these results might mean. So first off, the respondents reported being engaged in local newspapers. If you remember, the mean score for local newspapers were above the mean score of, or the midpoint of 3. So 3 is sometimes they use those sources, but the mean scores for other news sources were below the midpoint, as I pointed out to you, if you recall. So below the midpoint, 1 equals never and 2 equals seldom, okay? And so what this means that maybe there's room for improvement to increase local residents' news engagement. Okay, I think I should have deleted that comma as here, so that should be deleted. Sorry about that, it's a typo. So yeah, there's always room for improvement to try to increase CNMI residents' engagement in news, is what that might mean. Also, CNMI residents are reporting that they obtain their local news from social media platforms. If you recall, the findings for that, as I reported earlier. So this seems to follow recent national trends in the US, and this is research from Pew. For instance, Pew has found that a little over half of Americans reporting getting their news from social media, like sometimes or often. And here in the percentage of Americans who get their news, this is what the Pew has found. Facebook, and looks like Facebook and YouTube are the top scorers there in terms of where people get their news. And that's, I think, if you recall, that's what we found in this study as well. So our results, indicate Facebook and WhatsApp are being used more frequently. Oh no, I'm sorry, I take that back. It's Facebook and WhatsApp are the most frequently used for news. And in fact, they're using these more than the other legacy media, or some of the other legacy media. Also, for the most part, the CNMI respondent survey have an adequate level of trust of local news media. As I pointed out earlier, the scores were above the midpoint of 3. So that's a good thing. The respondents do trust local media. Also, results suggest that media use is positively associated with trust, and media use is positively associated with motivations for news consumption. And so this could mean a lot of things, but for the context here, this implies that increasing media trust and motivations to consume news are also important in creating a media engaged public in the CNMI. There's various ways you could go about doing that. Like one of them here is this webinar that the Northern Marianas Humanities Council is sponsoring. This could get people more engaged in media. And there are various limitations of this study. No study is perfect. And so sampling error and response error was an issue that I implied earlier. Sample was not randomly selected, and there appeared to be issues related with response error. Although, first of all, with random selection, there's a study done by my colleagues at EOG. They did a non-random selection that we call a response-driven approach. And we sort of modeled our approach with them, and what they found with that RDD response-driven approach, or RDS approach, is that approach comes close to getting accurate estimates of real-world phenomena, and so they found that that's the case in Guam, and if that's the case in Guam, it's likely also the case in the Marianas CNMI. And so we sort of modeled our method after them. But honestly, this is a trade-off. We could have went with a random sample, do a telephone interview, but the problem with that is we could not, with a telephone interview, it's going to be super lengthy. It's going to be costly to run a survey that we did, a long survey. And so that's a trade-off. We were able to administer a longer survey that examined a wider set of variables at reasonably low cost. And so we got a lot more out of this approach. And obviously there's a cross-sectional survey data, as I said earlier, cannot be used to test causality. We don't know what's causing what, but hopefully this serves as a foundation for subsequent empirical research. Maybe down the line, we could do more, run some other testing here, some experiments, and see what's causing what. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, our list of media was not exhaustive. Obviously, there's a lot of other platforms out there that people use these days, and we didn't include those. And also, we did not include specific social media pages like those of legacy media. And that is all for today. Use and perceived trustworthiness of media and social media, the variables that we talked about today in this webinar, these were also related with other civic indicators, which we will talk about in the next webinar. So stay tuned. And so if you want to contact me, this is my email. And thank you. I'm sorry I had to rush through this because I think I was so out of time.
Oh, don't worry about it, Francis. Your data is pretty important and actually very interesting. I know that I have a few questions which we will get into later. But what I wanted to do right now is hand the focus over to Thomas, who is going to go a little more in depth and humanize some of that data that you provided regarding regional coverage, because as some of us may know, Thomas has worked on Saipan and Guam. I'm familiar with Thomas's work because while he was a broadcast reporter on Guam, I saw a segment he did on the island of Luta, and I'm pretty sure that Thomas is going to mention that. All right. I see a little bit of chat from Galvin Guerrero saying that, you know, we have a little bit of something called the coconut wireless. I've also heard telephone alihai, right? Which is probably like a little bit of an older term, but that's probably in reference to some of these, I guess maybe you want to call it telephone, calling each other and sharing sharing information with each other and these sorts of things, which are now going online. All right, I'm going to hand this over now to you, Tomas. All right.
Thank you so much. And Francis, I can't thank you enough for all the work that you put into this and how it will be helpful. And also all the students that you train to be the next media makers. Really appreciate your work as an educator. And so as Andrew was mentioning, wanted to take this from a reporter's perspective in the region. So wanted to take a look at regional news. And so I think one thing as a journalist that we're constantly thinking about is that news media does not only set the agenda, but also the framing, the scope. Often asking myself, what is the story in the micro? What is the story in the macro? And basically what we can think of using this framework is, let's say there's a story about a road leading to someone's house that has never been fixed. In the micro, it's about that person's complaint. In the macro, is it a story about infrastructure in the Sinai, in the region, or even now as we see across the United States, is this a national story too? We also ask ourselves, how do we localize a national story? Today, in coordination with Francis, wanting to ask, how do we regionalize stories? And why should we cover the region? I think it's important to also note that it's not a matter of prioritizing or deciding at what levels we should tell it, but rather showing the breadth and the variety of ways that we can still tell stories even on the regional level. And so as we saw from the survey, over 80% of CNMI residents would like local media to carry more regional news. And so when we talk about things publishing or making it to air, I think one thing that I considered when we were first forming that question too is not only carrying regional news, but dedicating local resources, having newsrooms do their own original reporting from a regional framework. And I thought that some of the questions we can pose that we might call barriers to entry is whether or not newsroom leaders are ready to make the direct investment in regional news. How do struggling newsrooms prioritize regional news with limited staff and funding? How do advertisers and politics influence this approach? Is it more beneficial to stay on a local lens? What incentives exist to pursue this that could impact current news business models? And how might we work with existing independent journalists and other outlets, maybe to ease that barrier to entry and the burden that it takes? If there are independent journalists working across the region and we want to do original reporting, how might we take advantage of that dynamic? And so I wanted just to name some incentives, as always a student of journalism, that might be some motivations for newsmakers to decide what the story is in the micro, in the macro, locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally. We see that some incentives are advertising, right? Revenue and profits. Might not be as familiar in the CNMI or Guam, but a subscription-based incentive, audiences who pay for information. Is there a partisan incentive? Is this political, coming from the top? Or is this something that we might classify as nonprofit media, something that is directly and overtly public service oriented? Or is this an overt expression, a direct outlet for news media to participate in public dialogue? And so I wanted to just provide some of my personal reporting and experience of taking stories and making them, framing them in a way that speaks to the region. That very first story is something that Andrew shared, and it was actually one of the most viewed stories online at KUAM when it first published. And so Frank is a fisherman who helps families reach Rota. There was a story also about how the airlines that serve Rota are limited, and how Frank here transports people for funerals, for personal trips. One of the most compelling parts of this story, Frank, who's a resident of Guam, saying that at one point he had to transport a casket because it couldn't fit in the airplane on Rota. He also had to transport a person who was differently abled because the plane couldn't accommodate them. And so taking that story in the micro, Frank, a resident of Guam, just a good guy with a good heart, and zooming out, what does this mean? How are airlines responding to this? We got a statement from United Airlines that said that they're exploring the issue, and also got in touch with Star Marianas. I think also looking not just within Micronesia, but also what's happening in Hawaii. I was familiar and covered the Mauna Kea protests happening in Hawaii, in which the University of California is a major organizer and funder for. I was a student at UC Berkeley at the time, covering the issue. And when I went to Guam after graduation, I knew some activists within the movement who were also organizing on Guam. They actually had protests and roadside wavings for that. And so we spoke with Chamorro advocates who were joining Native Hawaiians protesting the building of the 30-meter telescope atop Mauna Kea, which was successful. I think we can't talk about regional headlines without talking about what we are still going through as a world, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I made a concerted effort to talk with physicians, both at the public hospital and independent private physicians, taking a look at what it means for the island in terms of testing. I think one thing that was very prevalent and something that Press Secretary Kevin Bautista also had a hand in informing the public was the differences in ways that Guam approached COVID-19's the response to COVID-19 and how the CNMI responded. And I think that continues to be kind of a way that residents on both regions, in Guam and in the NMI, continue to look at things. And someone asked me once, why is that the case? And I think oftentimes, at least as a viewer myself, when I look at something that's being done in a place that's similar to where I'm at, you often ask, why isn't it being done here? Or what can we do that's similar here where I'm living? And so that COVID-19, unfortunately, we're seeing variants come out, and news is still developing on that as more people are vaccinated. but that's also a story that we can continue and probably benefit from covering from a more macro regional lens. I think one other example too is watching a press conference at the White House where they announced that former President Trump decided to pull out of the World Health Organization, and just thinking, what does that mean for us? And found out that it actually affects Guam and the CNMI in a huge way, because much of the initial response, according to CEO Esther Muña, much of the initial response that allowed for the infrastructure to be built in such a fast way to respond to COVID-19 was much in part because of the World Health Organization helping the Asia Pacific region. And so looking at those national stories, even from the White House, and showing how it affects this region. I also got a chance at a press conference to ask Governor Lulian Guerrero on Guam how this affects it. And so this story with Lieutenant Governor Arnold Palacios' response was also paired with comment from Guam's governor. And that is just another example of how reporting can take on that lens of regional news. I also wanted to offer other examples of regional stories that have been picked up by different media outlets that are well known. We see here from The Guardian, the Pacific Islands Forum that recently shook regional relations as the Micronesian subgrouping walks out over a selection of the new Secretary General not honoring the quote unquote gentleman's agreement. Also wanted to include two stories from Marianas rooted journalists who are now working in the US. Anita Hofschneider did this story on Pacific Islanders not being able to return home, specifically Micronesians, even to bury their loved ones during COVID-19 because of the pandemic. And then also Rachel Ramirez writing about author Julian Uggen, an international human rights lawyer, his book and what that means generally for the issue of decolonization across the Pacific. So I wanted to show examples of not just trusted local media, what they can do, but also what big national, even international media has done in the region. And so I just wanted to end here with some final thoughts. I think covering regional news allows audiences to be better informed about how local issues impact other communities and vice versa. We've seen that in the COVID-19 response. Wait, Guam's stimulus check is out. Where's my stimulus check? Wait, Saipan is able to test people now. Are we able to test that many people? So those questions that people might be asking in their homes is really important and can't be ignored. Also, recognizing that regionalizing the news allows for more robust public dialogue and political participation. And lastly, we build communities that have shared values in the Pacific that may allow for shared solutions, all the way from climate, language revitalization, culture, military, economy, the list goes on. So I wanted to share those few thoughts along with the great research that Francis has done and that the council has supported. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you to both our presenters for, Thomas for humanizing and broadening some of the data that was provided by by Francis. Okay, now I'm seeing a number of questions coming in. All right, and I think we are a little over time by about 10 minutes, but I want to get to these questions. I don't mind going over time. How do our presenters feel about that? All right, and maybe we will wind up closing on time anyway, but let's go ahead and start. I'm going to read these questions off in the order that I received them, starting with Galvin de Leon Guerrero's question. He says that this is insightful quantitative data, and I look forward to ongoing analysis of the results. This I'm going to guess is directed at you, Francis. Is there a plan to complement this quantitative study with a more qualitative one, perhaps engaging interviews or focus group discussions?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a possibility. It's just for us, like doing research is just like finding time to do it. Yeah, we would like to do that. And the last panelists for this webinar, tentatively, I think that's going to be the last panel, is about the community values that data, and his name is Manny Cruz. He is a former journalist finishing up his PhD in Auckland, and he's moving back to Guam to work at UOG. And so he does more qualitative work, and we could ask him this question if he's interested, and if anyone is interested, they could we could work together on this. And so yeah, that's always an option if anyone's interested in doing qualitative work.
Okay, we have a question from Amir Yunus Hafideh. Dr. Dalisay, you cited Pew Research for social media platforms. However, in the slide regarding trustworthiness of local media, is the CNMI's trustworthiness of local media similar to local news in a state?
Hi, Amir. Earlier, or this morning, I was actually trying to find an answer to that question. And all I could find was, yeah, it's similar to the trust of local media in the CNMI is sort of similar to what is going on in the States. I found a statistic somewhere. I think I just closed out my browser, and it has like I think a 4-point scale, whereas we use like a 5-point scale, and it's sort of similar results in terms of what they're trusting. But as I said earlier, it's like, I think in the States, in the US in general, people tend to trust local media more than they trust national news. So that's something consistent with what's going on as well in the CNMI. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, and Francis, I also just found this new poll from Poynter. I don't think it's specific to local media, but the US in that new research, as you know, knowing that this panel is coming up, looking into it as well, of the 46 countries, the US ranks last in trust. And of those surveyed, just 29% say that they trust the media. Obviously, that also takes into account the huge debates about Fox, CNN, MSNBC, but just wanted to share that. I put the link there in the chat if anyone's interested.
Thank you for that, Thomas. I want to shoot a question over to Thomas, actually. You had that video about the boat captain who provides shuttle service or charter service back and forth to Luta, and you mentioned that was a popular video online. Your other coverage, how would you gauge the reception that the Guam audiences had towards regional news?
Yeah, there was a lot of engagement, not just with Guam audiences, but with Chamorros in the United States as well, in the continental US. There were lots of comments about that, and lots of people also just wondering how to get to Rota with Frank for free, because that's how he did it. But I would say that with every regional story that was done, that there was engagement, not just with the local community that it was done with, not just with Guam, but also with those in the US.
Francis, how can local media use the data that you have to curate, cultivate, create the content in the newspaper that they can then go to print or put online, or maybe send through WhatsApp? I don't know what our legacy media might have plans for, knowing that there are many people on island who use WhatsApp as a news source. How do you think that this data can help them?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we know that they're using social media platforms to get their news, then it's important that the local newsrooms use those platforms, right? And but what we found also is that trust and motivations for consumption go hand in hand with use, right? So maybe the newsrooms could figure out, ways in terms of how to get people's trust, increase that, and how to motivate them. And Tomas's, I think the first part of his presentation sort of touched on that. At least in the classroom, we've experimented with things like gamification, to get students involved in things and get them motivated. Will that work in a newsroom? I don't know. But yeah, I think one of the survey itself, we also measure what is it, perceptions of journalistic functions. And so that's going to be the results we'll cover, I think, in the last webinar. And so those results will touch on like what do residents of the respondents in the CNMI, how do they see the journalistic functions of local media? What do they perceive as important? Watchdog is one of them, for instance. A sense of community is another one like that. And so I think like those results will probably be informative for the local news organizations to sort of figure out like what's going on and what can we do better to get people more motivated to use our platforms.
Okay, I want to send this to both our panelists, actually. You know, there's a number of, there's seemingly, and I don't have the data on this, but there's seemingly an increase in the number of people who are leaving their islands, right? Not just here, perhaps even in our neighboring region. You know, does that have anything, does that affect the interest in regional news now that they're all, you know, now that our islanders have gone to wherever it is that they need to work? You know, has leaving island affected the hunger for regional news, and does that also have an effect on consumption of local news via social media? And I'm going to shoot this to both of you.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, and I think myself as a journalist would like to do more research and reporting on that. I think though with this, with the anecdote that you just shared, that I see so many ways that our storytelling can adapt and opportunities for more of those stories to be told. I mean, I was just in California and did a story about the elite bakery that was there. Obviously, you know, that's a softer news story about a Chamorro bakery in California, or the restaurant in San Francisco, Purbetsu. And even those stories were received well. There's a lot of, you know, Facebook groups I know that we're all a part of, whether that's Chamorros in the Mainland Facebook group, or CNMI Issues Facebook group, things like that. And I actually did compile a whole list of all those different groups that exist for another project, but I don't think there's an answer today for your question, Andrew, but I do see that there is so much opportunity to tell stories in that way that engages, you know, local audiences, those in the diaspora who have decided to leave and settle elsewhere, and those who've moved to other islands in Micronesia. I think just quickly, as I was working on a story on Senator Jude Hofschneider's bill to amend Article 12 regarding Indigenous land ownership, one thing that I also looked for was in CNMI election data, because of this, you know, if this legislative initiative were to pass and end up in the ballot, I also wanted to look at that and say how many of our voters are absentee. And so I think that, again, just looking at the different ways you can engage with a story is important. And if it happens to fall under regional, national, international kind of framing, then that is just even better. But ultimately, as a journalist, driven by just the curiosity for that original reporting and getting deeper into the story.
Francis, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of from experience, when I used to live in the mainland, like, yeah, I mean, I would, you know, sort of like crave like what's going on in Guam, right? And you know, and I think that's you know, what most people do, you know, it's part of the diaspora. And it's like this concept called the imagined community, you know, where we might be overseas or somewhere far from your home, but you want to know what's going on. And in terms of regional, you know, I was living in Seattle, and I was going to school in Pullman, the eastern part of Washington State. I was part of like Marianas community, right? So you're not just part of people from Guam. There's people from the CNMI who are part of those organizations, and so I would see how, yeah, you would also crave what's going on if you're from Guam, what's going on in the region, right? Because you care about that, and because you're also hanging out with people from the region. But that's all I could add to that.
Okay, are there any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, it's a little bit past time. And I just want to thank you guys. I want to thank Tomas. I want to thank Dr. Dalisay. This is an informative time for us. I appreciate that you would give us your time and your expertise. And before we go, I just want to mention Francis said that there would be some sharing of his data in a report form, and he's absolutely right. The name of that study is Media Use and Perceptions, Civic Behaviors and Attitudes on Local Issues in the CNMI. Currently, the Humanities Council, we're getting that edited, and then it will go online to our website. I just wanted to shoot that out to our attendees who may be interested in seeing the larger picture and even more data. It's coming. It's going to be, it should be on our website by next week. Okay, so I'm going to have that out for you, and it's going to be mentioned. We will notify the public via social media and social media. Yeah, that's where it's going to go. Okay, I think we can go ahead and end there. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. You can find this recorded webinar online. All right, we're going to go ahead and end it there. Thank you, everybody.